At some point in nearly every diet, a quiet frustration appears. You've reduced calories, cleaned up your meals, maybe even increased your activity, yet the mirror seems unmoved. Your face looks leaner, your arms feel lighter, your clothes loosen slightly, but the abdomen remains unchanged. This experience is so common that many people interpret it as personal failure, a lack of discipline, or proof that their body is somehow resistant to change. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth. What you are witnessing is not your body fighting you, but your biology executing a survival program that has been refined over hundreds of thousands of years. For most of human evolution, fat stored around the abdomen was not a cosmetic liability, it was an insurance policy. Abdominal fat is not merely passive energy storage, it behaves like a metabolically strategic tissue governed by powerful hormonal signals, particularly insulin and cortisol. Its role is not to disappear quickly, but to remain available during prolonged uncertainty. When food availability becomes unpredictable, protecting the organs that sustain life takes priority over aesthetics, and that hierarchy still governs your metabolism today. When you begin dieting, your body does not interpret your actions as a health goal or a lifestyle improvement. It interprets them as environmental information. A sudden reduction in calories signals potential scarcity, and before accessing deep fat reserves, the body runs internal checks to determine whether this change is temporary or represents a genuine threat. The first system it relies on is glycogen, the stored form of carbohydrate kept in the liver and muscles. Glycogen functions as a short-term energy buffer, and when calorie intake drops, it is rapidly mobilized, often within the first 1 to 3 days. This is why early weight loss feels dramatic. Glycogen binds water at a ratio of roughly 3 grams of water for every gram of stored carbohydrate. As glycogen is depleted, that water is released, causing the scale to drop quickly and the body to feel lighter. Clothes loosen, bloating subsides, and many people believe fat loss has accelerated. But metabolically, very little fat has been burned at this stage. The body is simply adjusting fluid balance and testing whether energy intake will stabilize or continue to decline. Only after several consecutive days of consistent calorie reduction does the body begin to shift its hormonal priorities. This is where insulin becomes central. Insulin's primary role is energy storage, not fat burning. When meals are frequent and carbohydrate intake is high, insulin remains elevated, effectively locking fat inside adipose tissue. As meal frequency decreases and glycogen availability declines, insulin levels begin to fall gradually. This decline is subtle, but it sends a critical signal. Stored energy may now be required to maintain function. Even then, abdominal fat remains resistant. The reason is not stubbornness but strategy. Fat is mobilized according to risk, not appearance. Visceral fat, the fat surrounding internal organs, is metabolically active and potentially dangerous when excessive, contributing to insulin resistance, inflammation, and cardiovascular disease. When energy becomes scarce, the body preferentially reduces this fat first, because doing so improves survival odds. Subcutaneous fat, particularly in the lower abdomen, is metabolically quieter and safer, and therefore accessed later. What you see in the mirror often lags behind what is happening internally, which is why improvements in blood sugar, cholesterol, and energy stability often occur well before visible changes in body shape. As the first week transitions into the second, many people encounter what feels like resistance. Weight loss slows, hunger increases, and energy may fluctuate. This phase is frequently misinterpreted as failure, but it is actually metabolic adaptation. The body is recalibrating its systems to operate efficiently on reduced energy intake. Hunger hormones rise to encourage consistency, energy expenditure becomes more economical, and the metabolism settles into a new rhythm. From an evolutionary perspective, this is protective, not punitive. The most common mistake during this phase is escalation. People respond by cutting calories further, adding excessive cardio, sacrificing sleep, and pushing harder. These actions elevate cortisol, the primary stress hormone, which directly signals the body to preserve energy and protect abdominal fat stores. Chronic cortisol elevation not only slows fat loss but actively shifts fat storage toward the midsection. This is why prolonged stress, aggressive dieting, and insufficient recovery are so strongly associated with stubborn belly fat, even in highly disciplined individuals. Fat loss is not driven by force. It is regulated by permission. That permission is granted through hormonal alignment. Insulin must be low enough to allow fat release, cortisol must be controlled enough to prevent defensive storage, and leptin, the hormone that communicates energy sufficiency, must stabilize. This environment does not emerge from extremes, it emerges from consistency. For some individuals, this transition occurs within days. For others, it may take 2 full weeks or longer, depending on genetics, muscle mass, diet history, and stress exposure. When the transition finally occurs, it is rarely dramatic. There is no sudden sensation of fat disappearing. Instead, energy becomes steadier, cravings soften, hunger feels less urgent, and mental clarity improves. The liver increases its production of fat-derived fuels, including ketones, and the body begins to rely more consistently on stored energy. This is metabolic flexibility in action, and it represents a return to the way human physiology evolved to function under variable conditions. Only after this foundation is established does the body begin to access stubborn fat stores reliably, including the lower abdomen. This is why the most important question in fat loss is not how aggressively you can diet, but how long you can remain consistent enough for your biology to feel safe releasing what it has protected for years. By the time you reach the 2nd and 3rd week of a consistent calorie deficit, something important begins to shift beneath the surface. This is the phase where many diets quietly succeed or fail, not because of willpower, but because of how well the body adapts to its new energetic reality. The initial shock of reduced intake has passed. Glycogen reserves are largely depleted, and the metabolism is no longer asking whether food will return tomorrow. Instead, it begins asking a more subtle question: how should energy be supplied now? This is where metabolic flexibility becomes central. Metabolic flexibility refers to the body's ability to switch efficiently between fuel sources, primarily glucose and fat, depending on availability. In metabolically inflexible states, the body relies heavily on constant carbohydrate intake and struggles when meals are delayed or calories are reduced. Hunger becomes urgent, energy crashes are frequent, and fat stores remain largely inaccessible. In contrast, when metabolic flexibility improves, the body becomes comfortable using stored fat as a reliable energy source, even between meals. During weeks 2 to 4 of dieting, this flexibility begins to develop, provided the deficit is moderate and consistent rather than extreme. Insulin levels remain lower for longer periods, allowing fat to be released from adipose tissue more steadily. The liver increases its capacity to convert fatty acids into ketones, which serve as an efficient fuel for the brain and muscles. This shift reduces the brain's dependence on constant glucose supply, which is why cravings often soften and mental clarity improves during this phase. Importantly, this transition does not require complete carbohydrate elimination. It requires predictability. When the body senses a stable pattern of intake, it adapts. When intake fluctuates wildly between restriction and overeating, the adaptation stalls. This is why crash diets often feel powerful initially, but collapse quickly. They create chaos rather than clarity in metabolic signaling. As metabolic flexibility improves, another important change occurs. Energy expenditure becomes more proportional to need rather than panic. In the early stages of dieting, the body conserves aggressively, interpreting uncertainty as threat. By weeks 2 and 3, if stress is managed and sleep is adequate, cortisol begins to stabilize. This is critical for abdominal fat loss. Cortisol's primary function is to mobilize energy during perceived danger, but chronic elevation tells the body to store fat centrally as protection. When cortisol declines, that protective signal weakens, and fat stored in the midsection becomes more accessible. This is also the stage where many people notice a paradox. The scale may move slowly or not at all, yet waist measurements begin to change. This occurs because fat loss and water balance no longer fluctuate dramatically, while body recomposition becomes more relevant. Visceral fat continues to decline, inflammation decreases, and insulin sensitivity improves. These changes reduce internal pressure and bloating, subtly tightening the waist even before significant subcutaneous fat loss becomes visible. Understanding the distinction between visceral and subcutaneous fat is essential here. Visceral fat is highly responsive to hormonal shifts and energy scarcity. It tends to decrease earlier in the process, improving metabolic health markers long before aesthetic changes occur. Subcutaneous fat, especially in the lower abdomen, is more hormonally conservative. It requires sustained signals of safety and energy sufficiency before being released. This is not inefficiency. It is design. During this phase, exercise begins to play a different role. In the early stages of dieting, exercise primarily increases energy demand, sometimes exacerbating stress if recovery is inadequate. In weeks 2 to 4, however, resistance training and moderate activity become powerful metabolic signals. Muscle tissue demands energy even at rest, raising baseline metabolic rate and improving insulin sensitivity. This creates a more favorable environment for fat mobilization without increasing hormonal stress. Excessive cardio, on the other hand, can undermine this balance if it pushes cortisol upward. The goal is not maximal calorie burn but metabolic signaling. Strength training, walking, and low to moderate intensity movement communicate safety and capability to the nervous system. They tell the body that energy expenditure is purposeful, not desperate. Sleep becomes non-negotiable during this stage. Deep sleep supports growth hormone release, tissue repair, and leptin regulation. Without adequate sleep, leptin signaling becomes distorted, hunger increases, and fat loss slows regardless of calorie intake. Many plateaus blamed on diet or genetics are, in reality, sleep plateaus. By the end of the 3rd or 4th week, individuals who remain consistent often report a noticeable internal shift. Hunger becomes predictable rather than overwhelming. Energy stabilizes across the day. The need for constant snacking diminishes. This is not discipline improving, it is biology adapting. The body is no longer resisting fat loss because it no longer perceives it as a threat. At this point, lower abdominal fat begins to respond, not explosively, but reliably. Changes are subtle at first, then accelerate. This is why long-term fat loss often feels slow until it suddenly doesn't. The groundwork is invisible, but once established, progress compounds. The critical mistake at this stage is impatience. Many people disrupt this fragile equilibrium by increasing restriction just as the body is prepared to release fat. Sustainable fat loss requires restraint not only in eating, but in intervention. Doing less at the right time often produces better results than doing more at the wrong time. Ultimately, weeks 2 through 4 are not about pushing harder, they are about staying consistent enough for the body to trust the process. When that trust is established, fat loss becomes a byproduct rather than a battle. By the time you move beyond the 4th week of a consistent, moderate calorie deficit, the conversation around fat loss changes in an important way. This is no longer about initiation or adaptation. This is about persistence, signaling, and timing. Many people reach this stage and feel as though progress has stalled permanently, especially when the lower abdomen remains resistant despite weeks of apparent discipline. In reality, what is happening is far more precise than most people realize. The body is not refusing to burn fat, it is deciding when it is safe to release the last reserves. Lower abdominal fat represents a unique biological category. Unlike fat stored in the arms, face, or upper torso, fat in the lower abdomen is often the most hormonally protected. It tends to accumulate during periods of prolonged stress, repeated insulin elevation, disrupted sleep, and years of inconsistent energy signaling. As a result, it becomes associated not just with energy storage, but with long-term survival memory. The body does not access it easily because doing so historically carried risk. This is why plateaus become more common at this stage, not because fat loss has stopped, but because the visible component of fat loss lags behind the internal work already completed. By weeks 4 to 6, visceral fat has often declined significantly, insulin sensitivity has improved, inflammation has reduced, and metabolic flexibility has stabilized. Internally, the body is healthier. Externally, the mirror may not yet reflect it. This mismatch between internal progress and external appearance is one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of fat loss. At this point, many people make a critical error. They confuse patience with complacency, or worse, they confuse patience with failure. In response, they tighten restriction further. Calories drop too low. Recovery suffers. Training volume increases without adequate rest. Sleep quality declines. These actions do not accelerate fat loss. They reverse the hormonal conditions that made it possible in the first place. When energy intake becomes too low for too long, the body activates additional conservation mechanisms. Thyroid hormone conversion slows, reducing metabolic output. Leptin levels decline, increasing hunger and decreasing energy expenditure. Cortisol rises to mobilize emergency energy, and in doing so, it reinforces fat storage in the abdomen. The body is not being stubborn. It is responding logically to perceived threat. This is where the concept of fat overshooting becomes relevant. Fat overshooting refers to the body's tendency to store fat more aggressively after periods of extreme restriction. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. If food disappears unpredictably, the safest response is to store more when it returns. This is why aggressive dieting so often leads to rebound weight gain that exceeds the starting point. It is not a failure of willpower. It is a predictable biological response to instability. To avoid this trap, the body must be shown consistency, not deprivation. Moderate deficits maintained over time communicate safety. Strategic pauses, sometimes referred to as diet breaks or refeeds, can help restore leptin signaling and reassure the nervous system that food availability is stable. These are not cheat days. They are metabolic communication tools. Used correctly, they prevent adaptive slowdown without erasing progress. During this phase, resistance training becomes even more valuable. Muscle tissue does not merely burn calories, it alters hormonal signaling. Increased muscle mass improves insulin sensitivity, raises resting energy expenditure, and creates a metabolic buffer against fat regain. Importantly, strength training also sends a signal of capability rather than scarcity. It tells the body that energy is being used to build, not just survive. At the same time, non-exercise activity, such as walking, light movement, and daily activity, plays a quiet but powerful role. These movements reduce stress hormones, improve circulation, and increase fat mobilization without triggering defensive responses. Fat loss at this stage responds better to calm consistency than aggressive intensity. Sleep and psychological stress management are no longer supporting factors, they are central drivers. Chronic sleep deprivation disrupts leptin and ghrelin balance, increasing appetite and decreasing satiety regardless of calorie intake. Persistent psychological stress maintains elevated cortisol, which specifically protects abdominal fat. No amount of dietary precision can override these signals indefinitely. By weeks 6 to 12, individuals who maintain stability often experience a noticeable shift. The lower abdomen begins to change more visibly. The waistline tightens. Fat loss accelerates, seemingly without additional effort. This is not sudden success, it is delayed expression. The body has finally received enough consistent evidence that releasing its most protected reserves is safe. This moment is often misinterpreted as a breakthrough caused by a new tactic. In reality, it is the result of weeks of unremarkable consistency. The mistake many people make is attempting to recreate this moment through escalation rather than recognizing it as a biological reward for patience. The final phase of sustainable fat loss is not about doing more, it is about maintaining an environment where the body no longer needs to defend itself. When energy intake is predictable, stress is managed, sleep is adequate, and muscle mass is preserved, fat loss becomes a background process rather than a daily struggle. This reframes the entire goal. Belly fat is not lost when you punish the body. It is released when the body trusts you. And that trust is built not through intensity, but through time, consistency, and respect for biological limits. When people ask how long it takes to burn belly fat, they are usually asking the wrong question. What they really want to know is why the process feels so slow, so inconsistent, and so emotionally draining compared to fat loss in other areas of the body. The answer is not hidden in discipline, motivation, or calorie math. It is embedded in how the human body prioritizes survival, stability, and safety over appearance. Belly fat is not stubborn because it resists effort. It is protected because it represents the last line of energetic security. Your body does not release it when you demand change. It releases it when the environment you create feels predictable enough that survival no longer feels threatened. This is why extreme diets so often fail. They create urgency, not safety. They tell the body to prepare for scarcity, not to relax into adaptation. Throughout this journey, one principle repeats itself again and again. Fat loss is not punishment-based, it is permission-based. Insulin must remain low enough to allow energy release. Cortisol must be controlled enough to prevent defensive storage. Leptin must be stable enough to signal sufficiency rather than deprivation. When these conditions align, fat loss becomes less of a struggle and more of a background process. This is also why the most reliable signs of fat burning are not found on the scale. They are felt internally. Energy becomes steady rather than volatile. Hunger becomes predictable instead of urgent. Cravings soften rather than dominate attention. Mental clarity improves. Sleep deepens. These changes signal that your metabolism is no longer locked into glucose dependency and stress-driven conservation. It has regained flexibility. At this stage, many people experience a subtle but powerful shift in identity. Eating less no longer feels like deprivation. Moving the body no longer feels like compensation. Fasting between meals feels natural rather than forced. This is not willpower increasing. It is physiology adapting. The body is no longer fighting change because it no longer fears it. One of the most important mistakes to avoid in this phase is the urge to constantly intervene. Many people disrupt their own progress by chasing novelty, adding new restrictions, cutting calories further, or intensifying training just as the body is finally responding. Sustainable fat loss requires restraint, not only in eating, but in interference. When the signals are working, the smartest move is often to stay out of the way. This does not mean complacency. It means consistency. It means maintaining a moderate calorie deficit rather than escalating it. It means prioritizing resistance training to preserve muscle, not punishing cardio to chase exhaustion. It means respecting sleep as a metabolic tool, not a luxury. It means managing stress not because it feels good, but because cortisol directly determines where fat is stored and released. Over time, this approach produces a very different outcome than aggressive dieting. Instead of cycles of loss and regain, the body learns a new baseline. Instead of rebounding, it stabilizes. Fat loss continues, not because effort increases, but because resistance decreases. The environment no longer signals threat, so defense is no longer necessary. This is why the timeline for visible belly fat loss varies so widely. For some, meaningful changes appear around week 6. For others, it takes 10 or 12 weeks. These differences do not reflect effort or worth. They reflect history. Years of stress, disrupted sleep, insulin resistance, and metabolic inconsistency take time to unwind. Biology does not erase long-term patterns on short deadlines. But once the shift happens, progress often accelerates. The fat that once seemed immovable begins to change. The waistline tightens, the body composition improves, and perhaps most importantly, the process no longer feels fragile, it feels stable. That stability is what allows fat loss to last. In the end, the most powerful transformation is not the loss of belly fat itself. It is the restoration of trust between you and your body. When you stop treating your metabolism like an enemy to be defeated and start treating it like a system to be understood, the struggle changes. Fat loss becomes cooperation instead of conflict. So, if you are early in the process, be patient. If you are in the plateau, stay steady. And if you are tempted to push harder, consider whether what your body needs is not more pressure, but more consistency. Because the body does not respond to force. It responds to signals. And the most powerful signal you can send is stability. If this video helped you understand why belly fat behaves the way it does, consider sharing it with someone who feels stuck in their process. Sometimes the difference between quitting and continuing is not motivation, but clarity. And clarity is where sustainable change begins.